The signal lasted 11 seconds. That was all. 11 seconds of broken audio, static, and one human voice screaming something that the automated relay station could not fully decode. Then the channel went dead. No follow-up, no rescue ping, no automated distress beacon, just silence, stretching out across the stars like something heavy had fallen and never gotten back up. The relay station logged it at 0342 ship time and flagged it as a priority transmission. By the time the flag reached the United Earth Navy's Deep Space Monitoring Center on Titan, 4 hours had already passed. The duty officer on watch, a young man named Corporal Ren Vasquez, stared at the log entry for a long moment. Then he picked up the comm and called his superior. Commander Yara Osei was already awake. She had a habit of waking before her alarm, a leftover from years of service on patrol routes where sleeping too deeply could get you killed. She listened to Vasquez read the log entry and felt something cold move through her chest. Not fear exactly, something quieter than fear. The kind of feeling that comes just before you understand something terrible. "Get the Undying ready," she said. "We're going to Kepler's Reach." The UES Undying was a scout frigate. Fast, lean, and not built for a fight. It had a crew of 42 and enough firepower to hold off a light patrol vessel if things went badly. Commander Osei had served on it for 3 years and trusted it the way a person trusts something that has kept them alive long enough. She stood on the bridge as the ship dropped out of faster-than-light travel and looked at what was left of Kepler's Reach. For a moment, she said nothing. Nobody on the bridge said anything. Kepler's Reach had been a colony of 4.2 million people. It sat on a planet called Aurum, named for the amber color of its sky when the light hit the upper atmosphere just right. The colonists had been there for 60 years. They had built cities, farms, schools, hospitals. They had a university. They had a professional sports league. They had children who had never seen Earth and called Aurum home with the same ease that people on Earth called their own neighborhoods home. What Commander Osei saw when the Undying came out of FTL was a graveyard. The planet still turned. That was the worst part somehow. Aurum still rotated on its axis, still caught the light of its star, still looked like a planet from the outside. But the surface was wrong. The cities were gone. Not damaged, not bombed. Where there had been structures and streets and parks and people, there was now a flat, blackened crust, as if something had pressed the surface of the world down flat with enormous heat and held it there until everything stopped moving. The orbital stations were debris. The defense platforms were clouds of shrapnel, drifting in slow arcs. The colony's small fleet of transport vessels had been reduced to expanding fields of twisted metal. There were no escape pods. There were no distress beacons from survivors in shelters or bunkers. The automated agricultural relay satellites, which should have been transmitting crop data on a 12-hour cycle, were all silent. "Run it again," Osei said, her voice very flat and very even. Her sensor officer, Lieutenant Dakarai Mensa, ran the scan again, then a third time. He looked at his screen for a long time before he answered. "No life signs, Commander. Not on the surface, not in orbit, not on any of the moons." He paused. 4.2 million people. There's nothing. Osei walked to the viewport and looked out. She had done this job for 16 years. She had seen damaged colonies, raided outposts, systems where conflict had left scars. She had never seen anything like this. This was not a battle. A battle left wreckage you could read, chaos you could trace. This was an execution. She turned to her communications officer. "Pull everything. Every satellite log, every relay buffer, every automated system that's still running. I want to know what happened here." It took 2 hours to piece it together. The picture that emerged was almost simple in its brutality. A Vreth Dominion fleet, numbering somewhere between 300 and 400 warships, had arrived at Aurum, without warning and without any communication. They had not issued a demand. They had not given the colonists time to evacuate. They had opened fire on the orbital defense platforms first, then on the colony ships in dock, and then on the planet's surface. The entire operation had taken less than 6 hours from first contact to silence. The 11-second transmission had been the last thing the relay station picked up before the Vreth destroyed it too. The voice in the transmission had been a woman's. She was saying a name, over and over. Osei listened to it 4 times, and then made herself stop. The Vreth Dominion had issued an ultimatum to Earth's diplomatic corps 32 days earlier. They had declared that the Aurum system fell within their sphere of territorial expansion, and that human presence there was unacceptable. Earth had been in the middle of formal diplomatic negotiations. Messages had been going back and forth between human envoys and Vreth representatives for 3 weeks. The talks had been slow, but had not broken down. There had been no indication that the Vreth intended to move this quickly. There had been no final warning. They had simply come and done what they did. Before the Undying left the system, Lieutenant Mensa found something on the surface. His long-range visual sensors, sweeping the wreckage of what had been the colony's main city, picked up a section of wall still standing in the middle of the burned landscape. Most of it was scorched black. But in one corner, sheltered by the angle of the collapse, a mural had survived. It was painted in bright colors, the kind of colors children use. It showed a family standing in front of a house, under an amber sky, with a sun drawn in the corner, and birds flying in a line. Osei looked at it for a long time. Then she looked away. "Set course for the nearest relay point," she said. "Full speed. I need to transmit to Earth." She wrote the message herself. She kept it short. She attached the sensor data, the satellite logs, the orbital imaging, and the 11-second transmission. At the end, she added one line of her own. "They answered diplomacy with extinction. There are no survivors. 4.2 million people. I am sending everything. Do with it what you will." She pressed send and stood at the comm station while the transmission went out, moving at the speed of light toward a subspace relay that would carry it across the distance to Earth. Then she walked back to her chair and sat down and stared at the viewport for a very long time. Behind the Undying, Aurum kept turning, slow and quiet and completely empty. The amber sky, visible in a thin band along the day side of the planet, was still beautiful from a distance. If you did not know what had happened, you might have mistaken it for a world that was simply sleeping. And in 72 hours, Earth would know too. And then, everything would change. The transmission from Commander Osei reached Earth at 0917 on a Tuesday morning. By noon, the United Earth Senate had called an emergency session. By midnight, every major news network across 14 human-settled worlds was broadcasting the sensor footage from Kepler's reach. By the following morning, there was not a single human being alive who did not know what had happened to the 4.2 million people of Aurum. For 48 hours, Earth grieved. People filled public squares and cities across the planet. They held candles and stood in silence and cried together, without knowing the names of the people they were crying for. It did not matter. They were human. The colony of Aurum had been home to people who had gone out into the dark of space to build something new. And those people were gone now, and the whole of humanity felt that absence like a missing tooth, pressing at the empty space with their tongue and finding nothing there. Then the grief shifted. It did not disappear. Grief like that does not disappear quickly. But it was joined by something else, something that had no softness in it at all. It moved through the population the way a fire moves through dry grass. Slowly at first, touching one person and then another. And then suddenly all at once, everywhere, unstoppable. On the third day after the transmission arrived, the United Earth Senate voted. The vote was not close. Protocol Anvil had existed in a sealed document in the Senate's emergency archives for over a century. It had been written during a period of early space expansion, when human leaders, looking out at a galaxy full of unknown civilizations, had decided it was better to be prepared for the worst and never need that preparation, than to need it and not have it. Protocol Anvil was, in simple terms, a total war authorization. It gave the military unlimited manufacturing priority. It allowed the conscription of civilian freight fleets and shipyard workers. It suspended all diplomatic negotiations with the offending party. It released every cold storage military vessel from maintenance holds. And it placed the entirety of Earth's war-making capacity under the command of a single admiral, chosen by the Senate, answerable to no one until the crisis was resolved. They chose Admiral Hector Voss. Voss was 61 years old and had been retired for 3 years. He was a large man who had spent most of his career doing things quietly and without drama, which in the military usually means you are very good at what you do. He had fought in the Halcyon border conflict, the siege of Meridian Station, and the Cassian territorial crisis. He had never lost a fleet engagement. He had never lost a capital ship with its crews still aboard. He read the Senate's request, sat with it for about 4 minutes, and then accepted. "Tell me what I have," he said to the logistics officer who met him at the shipyard. What he had was staggering. Over the course of the previous century, as humanity had expanded outward and encountered other civilizations, a quiet doctrine had developed in the UEN's strategic planning divisions. It was never announced publicly. It was rarely discussed even in military circles. But it was practiced faithfully, year after year, administration after administration. The doctrine was simple. Build ships, store them, never stop. Every shipyard that had spare capacity was encouraged to fill it. Every mothballed vessel was kept in working order, rather than dismantled. Funds were allocated quietly, through budget lines that sounded bureaucratic and dull, and the ships accumulated in deep space dry docks, distributed across 24 systems. Nobody had ever intended to use all of them at once. They were insurance. They were the answer to a question nobody wanted to ask. But the question had been asked now, written in the ash of 4.2 million dead, and Hector Voss looked at the numbers and felt something settle in him like a stone dropping to the bottom of deep water. 700,000 warships. Not all of them were frontline battleships. Many were destroyers, frigates, carrier vessels, supply ships, and support craft. But they were all armed, all crewed once activated, all capable of deep space travel. The Vreth Dominion, at the height of its military power, could field roughly 90,000 vessels. They had been considered the 4th largest military force in the known galaxy. They had looked at humanity and seen a scattered, peaceful species with a fondness for diplomacy and a modest defense force. They had miscalculated on a scale that was almost difficult to comprehend. Across 14 human worlds and dozens of stations, the activation orders went out simultaneously. Shipyard workers who had been maintaining cold storage vessels in rotating shifts for years suddenly found themselves working around the clock. Civilian freight pilots received conscription notices and reported to military processing centers. Retired officers got calls, just as Voss had. Volunteer enlistment offices on every human world had lines stretching around the block before the morning was over. In deep space, watching from a respectful distance, a Thanari observation vessel recorded everything. The Thanari Collective was one of the oldest civilizations in this part of the galaxy. They had observed humanity for nearly 200 years, with a mixture of curiosity and cautious respect. Their chief observer, a being named Soth Ben Ara, filed a report to the Collective's Council that was later described as the most alarmed communication in Thanari diplomatic history. The humans have activated their reserve fleets, the report said. All of them. The scale of what we are observing is without precedent. We recommend the collective immediately inform the Vreth Dominion that they have made a grave miscalculation. We do not believe the Dominion fully understands what humanity is capable of when it chooses to act as one. The collective sent the warning. The Vreth High Command received it, read it, and dismissed it. They had seen humanity's regular defense forces. They had run the numbers. They believed the collective was exaggerating, perhaps even trying to protect some political interest. The Vreth had fought 4 major wars and won all of them. They knew what a dangerous species looked like. They looked at humanity and did not see danger. They saw inconvenience. In a shipyard orbiting Mars, Hector Voss stood on the bridge of a newly activated battleship and watched through the viewport as row after row of vessels lit up their running lights in the dark. It was a sight that had no comparison to anything he had seen in his career. The ships stretched out in every direction, filling the space around the yard like a city made of metal and purpose. Further out, in other systems, he knew the same thing was happening, all of it moving toward the same moment. His aide handed him a status report. Voss read it without expression. Then he gave his first order. The flagship will be renamed the UES Kepler's Reach, he said, effective immediately. His aide made a note. Nobody in the room said anything for a moment. Then slowly, someone started to clap. It moved through the bridge crew quietly and without fanfare, just hands coming together, just people acknowledging what the name meant and what they were about to do. Voss did not clap. He looked out at the ships and did the quiet arithmetic of someone who has spent his life thinking about how conflicts end, not just how they begin. 4.2 million people. He was going to make certain that number was never repeated. He was going to make sure that every civilization in this galaxy looked at what had happened to Aurum, and then looked at what came next, and understood, in the deepest part of whatever passed for their instinct, that this was the cost, this was the bill, this was what it meant to confuse human patience for human weakness. In 6 days, the fleet would be ready to move. 700,000 ships, crewed, armed, pointed in one direction. The galaxy did not know it yet, but the drums had started. The first alien civilization to detect the human fleet was the Cathori Merchant Syndicate. Their long-range sensor array, positioned at the edge of the Orion Arm to monitor trade route activity, registered the FTL signatures of the departing human armada, and immediately flagged the data as a system error. The Cathori technician, who received the alert, ran a diagnostic, found nothing wrong with the equipment, and then ran the numbers again. When the numbers came back the same, she sat back in her chair and stared at the display for a very long time. She was looking at 700,000 ships dropping out of FTL travel in a coordinated wave across a front that stretched for millions of kilometers, all of them moving in the same direction, all of them accelerating toward Vreth space. She flagged it as urgent and sent it up the chain. By the time it reached the Syndicate's Senior Council, 3 other civilizations had already picked up the same readings. Emergency diplomatic channels lit up across the sector. The Fenari Collective issued an immediate advisory to all neutral parties, recommending they move their vessels out of the projected transit corridor. The advisory was calm in tone and very specific about the physics. It said nothing about what humanity was doing or why. It did not need to. Everyone already knew. Aboard the UES Kepler's Reach, Admiral Hector Voss received the reports of the alien sensor detections and read them without changing his expression. His communications officer asked if they should transmit anything to the observing civilizations. Voss thought about it for a moment. No, he said. We're not asking for anything, and we're not explaining ourselves. They can watch. The transit would take 6 weeks at the speed the fleet was traveling. 6 weeks of coordinated FTL jumps, resupply operations, and constant system checks on 700,000 vessels. The logistics alone were a staggering operation. Voss had 3 full Admiralty staffs working in rotation just to keep the fleet organized. Every day brought new challenges, new adjustments, new problems that had never been solved before, because no one had ever moved a force this size across this kind of distance. They solved every one of them. On the 4th day of transit, a live broadcast went out from the flagship. Every human world received it simultaneously. Every soldier, sailor, pilot, and support crew member aboard the 700,000 ships watched it on their personal screens, or gathered in mess halls and common rooms to see it together. Admiral Voss stood in front of a camera on the bridge of the Kepler's Reach and spoke for approximately 4 minutes without notes. He did not give a rousing speech. He spoke quietly, in simple language, the way a person speaks when they have thought about something for a long time and have arrived at a place of absolute clarity. "You know why we're here," he said. "You know what happened. I'm not going to describe it to you again, because I don't think you need to hear it again. What I want to tell you is this. We are going to find the people who gave that order. We are going to hold them responsible in front of the whole galaxy. And we are going to make it permanently, unmistakably clear that the 4.2 million people of Aurum were not acceptable losses. They were not a message. They were not a bargaining chip. They were people, and they deserved to live." He paused for a moment. "We're going home to Kepler's Reach. Even if all that's left of it is ash, we're going home. And we're going to make sure this never happens again." He stepped away from the camera. The broadcast ended. Across the fleet, in hundreds of thousands of ships, people sat quietly with what they had just heard. Some of them cried. Most of them did not. Most of them simply looked at each other and then went back to their stations. On a frigate near the rear of the formation, Lieutenant Senna Okafor was not watching the broadcast with her crewmates. She was sitting alone in a small maintenance corridor near the engine compartment, which she had discovered early in the transit was one of the few places on the ship where she could be quiet without anyone checking on her. She had grown up on Aurum. Her parents had been there. Her younger brother had been there. Her childhood home had been in a city that no longer existed. She had joined this fleet because there was nowhere else she could think of to be. Not to be a hero, not because she was angry, though she was, but because she needed to be moving toward it, rather than sitting still. Sitting still felt like it might swallow her whole. She sat in the maintenance corridor and listened to the hum of the engines, and thought about the amber sky. Meanwhile, in the Vreth Dominion, the intelligence officer, Scarath 4, was having the worst week of his professional life. His original warning report, filed after the attack on Aurum and dismissed by High Command, had now been retrieved from the archive and was being circulated at emergency council meetings. Scarath 4 was not being credited with foresight. He was being treated as someone who had failed to make his warning clear enough.